the background is actually on theme this time around. It's crazy. Now, Midway, 2019, the movie, is a pretty good movie. I recommend it for the reason that Hollywood this time around decided to respect the source material, which is history. Usually, they don't respect it even if they're doing something based on historical events. But this time, they did, and I think it should be rewarded as such. People should see the movie. Now, there are a couple of issues when it comes to pacing, the use of a green screen, or maybe it's CGI, unsure, and a little bit of the historical inaccuracies. Now, the historical inaccuracies are kind of due to pacing. Either they didn't have time to talk about the entire battle or all the aspects of the battle or who particularly was in a down aircraft. Certain people are mixed around when that kind of stuff happens. But overall, the narrative historically accurate, the events historically accurate. Bruno Guido's tail gun shooting down a twin engine Betty historically accurate. Now, the movie has all of the right ingredients for people that just want to see a war film. It has the action, it has the explosions, it has the tensions if you don't actually know what happens in the situation. Because if you know the history, you kind of know what's going to happen to a lot of the characters mentioned. But if you don't know the history, you get the tension. If you do know the history, you get the action. It's kind of cool. You get to see aerial combat. Now you got to remember this is World War II aerial combat, so they're using planes as you see like that, and not the jet fighters we know today, which it's not going to be Top Gun, right? Anyway, it is a good movie for the time, and yeah, it also shows a deep understanding of what drives a character driven narrative, which is why it focuses in on people like McCluskey, Richard Best, Chester Nimitz, Bull Halsey, Leighton of Naval Intelligence, Yamamoto, um, Nagumo, and Tojo is also in the movie. In the one scene where it shows the inter service rivalry between the Japanese army and the Japanese navy, all of the admirals and generals are on the two sides of the table arguing with each other about where they should allocate the funds of the Japanese nation. Should they continue invasions, land invasions into China, or should they focus on the naval battle with the United States in Midway or other places, and you get to see the arguments there. And because there are characters, you would get emotionally invested into these characters. So it knows how to do that correctly. It gives you a reason to care. Because it mostly focuses on Richard Best and his relationship with his friends that are also in the service, with people that he graduated with in the academy, the effects of Pearl Harbor on him, the effects of his successful missions, the effects of losing a wingman, that kind of stuff. So it does build an emotional connection with the audience as well as the military stuff, as well as focusing and giving a respectful recounting of history. And because it does all of these things sort of well, I think the personal level, is the weakest part, and everything else is like the strongest part. But because it does all of these things so well, I would recommend people watch the movie. Now, is the Midway battle the main focus of this movie? No, it is not. It actually starts out way before Midway, actually way before World War II, or the U.S. is actually involved in World War II, and actually way before World War II even started. It starts out during the London Naval Treaty, where Britain and the West is kind of giving a, what is it called? Um, an arms control treaty, sort of what we have today with ICBMs and nuclear weapons. It was a treaty that limits the amount of capital ships that a nation is allowed to build. Now, it starts out all the way out there, and then Leighton goes and talks with the Admiral Yamamoto and says, "Hey, look, I see that tensions are boiling up between the United States and Japan. Is there some way we could alleviate these things?" And Yamamoto basically says, "Hey, if you just stay out of Japan's way, then the more moderate people will negotiate, will bring the temperature down." The U.S. after that, a renew offensive into China after Japan does its thing in China, Marco Polo Bridge. After the incident with a U.S. transport ship in the region, the U.S. decides to embargo Japan, stop selling them oil, stop selling them scrap metal. So Japan is starving of resources, getting bogged down in China. They decide we have to do Pearl Harbor. Now, this is where the second scene of the movie starts. It starts on the deck of the USS Enterprise, which also the Lucky E, one of the aircraft carriers that basically never sunk during the entire Pacific War, and during the time was the only carrier able to project American force in the Pacific War. Now, it doesn't go all the way to that period of time. It ends during the Battle of Midway. So, no Enterprise versus Japan. Just know this is the Lucky E, or I think it's also called the Gray Ghost, because the Japanese thought they sunk it a couple of times, and each time they thought they sunk it, the Enterprise would come back, and so the Gray Ghost is another name for the USS Enterprise. Now, the USS Enterprise just finished delivering, I think, supplies and resources to the island of Midway, and is coming back to port Pearl Harbor when the port is attacked, obviously, by the entire Kido Butai, and then they bomb Pearl Harbor, the destruction of the Arizona. You get to see from, I think, uh, we get to see from a couple of people on deck of the Arizona during that time how the attack was taking place, how it affected the ships. We've seen the Arizona ripped apart and blown into bits, seen the escape of a crewman, Sully, into the hospital wing, and then the death of one of the people that also graduated the Naval Academy with Richard Best, and that is kind of the introduction to Pearl Harbor. Obviously, Enterprise sends scout planes into Pearl. They get picked off by the fighters that are flying escort for the Japanese bombers and torpedo planes. So a couple of USS Enterprise's scout planes get shot down. Bull Halsey decides to take the Enterprise on a reprisal mission, though because of a bilateral reading, they go south instead of north, which is a lucky thing, because if they went north, it would be one aircraft carrier against the entire Kido Butai, which the U.S. Enterprise would probably have been sunk. But because they went south and found nothing, the Enterprise was spared and was able to continue operating in the Pacific. It rolls into port, and here is where we get a scene with the Pacific Command. which has now been transferred to Chester Nimitz. So Nimitz becomes the basically de facto leader of the Pacific Fleet, while MacArthur is the leader of the Pacific Armed Forces. So MacArthur, Army, and Army Air Force, Chester Nimitz, Navy, and Naval Air Force. So that's kind of how it's split. Sort of. U.S. and Japan both kind of have an inter service rivalry between MacArthur and Chester Nimitz and Tojo and Yamamoto. Sort of the same thing, but it wasn't hostile. The American side was more like we're just not going to speak to each other and do our own thing, while in Japan it was actually a hostile antagonism against each other. Each branch of the military had for each other and hostile antagonism. Anyways, after Chester Nimitz gets control of the Pacific Fleet. They have to counterattack, and then this is where the Marshall Islands raid comes in. This is the second action set piece, which is the Marshall Islands raid. We skip through a lot of raids that occur prior to this and after this point, but the Marshall Islands was one that was focused on probably because of Bruno Guido, the story of a machinist mate that hopped onto the tail gun of a what is it? A dive bomber, was it SBD dive bomber, and shot down a kamikaze twin engine Betty, and that was actually historical fact. If you see it in the film, it seems exaggerated. No, actually, what happened, and he got a double promotion right there by Bull Halsey, which again is shown in the movie. After which, the movie then switches again to a operation where the U.S. is to hit the Japanese homeland. This is where Hornet gets introduced, and Hornet has a bunch of U.S. Army bombers on its flight deck. This is the Doolittle raid, and we get a little bit with Doolittle during and post raid. Again, this is probably, I would consider this the third action set piece. And if you didn't know what happened to the Doolittle raid, it could be a little bit of a suspenseful part in the story. But if you do know what happened, then you know the gist of how it's going to end up. And it didn't show much of the destruction of the homeland. Of Japan, but that's because most of the damage was negligible, at least according to most analysts. So the Doolittle raid was more of a symbolic hit, though it did delay the construction of a Japanese aircraft carrier by quite a long time. So then the operation in the Coral Sea, Bull Halsey takes its entire task force down to the Coral Sea to support the Lexington and the Yorktown. When Bull Halsey's fleet gets there, however, the battle's already over. The Lexington is sunk, and the Yorktown is badly damaged. This is when the code breakers basically deciphered that there's going to be an attack at Midway, and Bull Halsey gets a message from Chester Nimitz to get spotted and pull the task force back into Pearl, which is what they do. They fix the Yorktown up in 48 hours, I think, or is it 72? I'm not sure. They fix it up in 3 or 2 days when the estimated time of repair was 1 month, at least 1 month. So great engineering by the US, I guess. And that is also a historically accurate thing. Then the USS Hornet, the USS Enterprise, the USS Yorktown all go to a staging area above Midway, and this is where the final leg of the movie takes place, the Battle of Midway. Um, Richard Best is shown to hit two carriers, which is true, and all four of the Japanese aircraft carriers are sunk, with the loss of the USS Yorktown by a submarine after the battle. So that's kind of how it ends. And then Bruno Guido, obviously, he does get killed in history and in this movie, and it shows it. He gets thrown overboard as reprisal, I guess, or sort of a petty revenge thing for what the Enterprise and uh, the Yorktown and the Hornet did to the Japanese Kirobutai, or the four carriers that were a part of the Keto Butai, because the last two were at the Battle of the Coral Sea, and because of slight damage and the loss of an entire air wing, those two carriers had to go back to Japan for refit and restock. So Japan was fighting with four carriers, and the four carriers got sunk for the loss of one of the U.S. carriers, which the movie portrays well. And yeah, overall, I think it's a great movie. People should see it. This is a bit of a ramble. And yeah, next week I am going to cover the Greyhound movie. And the week after that, I'll probably talk about the difference between movies that are based off of true historical events, and then movies based off of fiction that is based off of historical events. So the difference between Midway and Greyhound. But overall, Midway is a solid movie that has solid characters that you could get invested in, that is historically accurate, respects the historical material that it's taking from, and only has a slight issue with green screens and pacing, which is due to the fact that they crammed all of the initial parts of the Pacific War into the movie. If they focused on one or two battles, then maybe it would be even more accurate than it is now. But because they decided to do everything, they had to lose a couple of details, and then a couple of pacing issues arise because, well, you can't focus on the entire Battle of Midway when there's just so much happened in that one battle that there are plenty of 1 hour documentaries just talking about that. So this movie could just center around that. They didn't decide to do it. And so a couple of important or less so important pieces got cut from this movie. Overall, great. Recommend. Go watch it. Yeah. Bye.